Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and public affairs. We're broadcast on Great Plains Television, that's channel 26.1, Sundays at 8:30 and then 4:30, but we've also got some new times on Saturday, so I'll ask you to look at my site, The Voice for Liberty, at wichitaliberty.org to look at those. Also at wichitaliberty.org, you'll find show notes for today's episodes, all the old episodes of Wichita Liberty TV, and lots of other material that I and others create almost every day. Well, today our special guest is Senator Jim DeMint. He served in the United States House of Representatives from 1999 to 2005, representing the 4th District of South Carolina, that's Greenville and some areas around there. From 2005 to 2013, he served in the United States Senate, again representing South Carolina. From 2013 to 2017, he was president of the Heritage Foundation, one of our leading think tanks in America, and now he serves as senior advisor to Citizens for Self-Governance, a group which is seeking to call the Convention of States to propose some new amendments to the United States Constitution. With Senator DeMint is David Schneider, who's the regional director for Citizens for Self-Governance. You may remember David from his appearance here in June. So, gentlemen, welcome to Wichita Liberty
Bob,
TV.
great to be with you, Carl. Good to be with you.
It's a privilege. So, Senator DeMint, you were a prominent supporter of the Tea Party. It seems like a long time ago. It really wasn't all that long ago, with even the New York Times headline calling you a Tea Party hero. But we don't hear a lot about the Tea Party anymore. Why is that? And I guess kind of an underlying question is the Convention of the States movement kind of the successor maybe to some of the Tea Party spirit?
It's a great question because in some ways it is. The Tea Party's still there. That yearning to do something to change what's going on in Washington. And some of the formal Tea Party organizations are still in place, but the media vilified that Tea Party label so much that many now have joined other organizations, Americans for Prosperity, Freedom Works, or they've organized in different ways. But what we see with the Convention of States is it does include a lot of folks in the Tea Party movement who believed if they elected the good people to Washington, that would change things. And these folks have become discouraged, and they've seen we've given the Republicans a majority in the House and the Senate and then the presidency, and it's still not happening the way that they had hoped. And so they're seeing the Convention of States is a very real and tangible way that they can take back control from the federal government, that whole federalism idea. That spirit, that Tea Party spirit, which is truly an American spirit, is still there. And so I meet them all over the country. They just want to know, they grab my arm and they say, what can I do? What can I do? And Convention of States is an answer to what can I do. This is very specific, and getting something done at the state level is much more realistic than in Washington.
So it sounds, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you sounded a little bit skeptical of the idea that if we can just get the right people into office, then everything's going to be okay. Conventions or constitutions are much more durable than people. Is that the right way to think about it?
It's true, and no one worked harder than I did to elect good people. I started Senate Conservatives Fund in 2010. We raised well over $20 million to help bring in people like Rand Paul and Mike Lee and Pat Toomey and Marco Rubio. We had actually 12 new folks who came in, and when they came in the door, I had enough votes in the Senate to get rid of earmarks at the time. But over time that I've seen that really the establishment pressure inside Washington changes most of them. There's still good people, but they lower their expectations and they begin to see that they really can't get things done. And if you do, the pushback from Washington and even the Republican leadership is very painful. So over time, a lot of people just give up. There are not too many people like Mike Lee and Ted Cruz who continue to take the punishment every day. So I think that's what the folks in the Tea Party and certainly I've realized is we need to elect good people, but that's not enough. And frankly, no matter who we elect, no matter what party's in charge, I'm convinced Washington will never fix itself.
So changing the Constitution, which is difficult to do by design, I think, is seen as a way to getting better reforms than just electing people that may be. Should we use the word swamp? Is that appropriate?
Swamp's a good word. Sewer, I think you used before we started the show. But let me clarify. I'm not doing this because I want to change the Constitution. I'm doing this because I want to restore it. The Constitution that's used in Washington is not the little pocket Constitution that we carry around and love. There's a 2,800-page annotated Constitution you can order from the government printing office that is a compilation of all the case law and precedent that has occurred over time. And that's why judges in Congress can ignore the 10th Amendment that says the federal government can only do what's in the Constitution. The rest is left to the states and the people. The way they ignore that is they now use a different Constitution. We need a convention of states to propose amendments that clarify and restore the original limits of the Constitution, that re-clarify what the 10th Amendment really means and throw out all the case law, to clarify what the Commerce Clause means. The Commerce Clause didn't give the federal government the right to run our schools and our healthcare system, but that's what judges have determined over time, as well as Congress. So I like the Constitution the way it was written in the first place, and if all we did is said we were serious the first time, that would be enough. But we have to do something in the form of a clarifying amendment that actually forces the courts and Congress to follow the original intent of the Constitution.
Well, let's take our first commercial break today, and when we come back, I think, Carl, you're probably going to ask a question about just what is the Convention of States and what might it end up doing for us.
Absolutely.
So we'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. With us this week, Senator Jim DeMint of the Working with Convention of States movement, David Schneider, Regional Director. Carl, I think you had a question about the Convention of States.
Absolutely. There have been a number of efforts to have conventions of states in the past, but arguably only the Constitutional Convention that replaced the Articles of Confederation has actually one occurred. Isn't this an awfully high benchmark that you're shooting for, and is it really practicable to try and achieve?
Yeah. Well, it was intended to be hard to amend the Constitution. There are only two ways. Congress can suggest them, or states can suggest amendments. Either way, 38 states have to ratify. That is a hard bar, and actually, since the Constitution was written, 400 states have called, 400 state legislatures have called for an Article 5 convention. The reason it hasn't happened is you've got to have 34 states that call for a convention around the same subject matter. Unless the agenda is agreed to in advance by the call to convention, you won't have a convention. So that's why it's important that 34 states adopt the same language that we've worked on and we've passed already in 12. Yeah, it's a high bar, but it's something I think more and more Americans are realizing that it's the only way to save our country. Washington cannot save our country. They can't stop spending. I know people wonder when I say that they can't. It is no longer structurally possible for Washington to ever balance the budget, and you have to be there to understand that now. And so if you, I talked about balancing the budget a few years ago in the Senate, and proposed a 10-year phase-in, and even Republican leadership said that was extreme. And if you keep spending more than you're bringing in, you're going to bankrupt the country. So it's a high bar, and it should be. But I'm convinced that we've got 12 states really have come in basically in the last 2 years. Every day Washington gives states another reason to do this, because Washington has taken more and more control, and they will not give back control. And I think states are starting to see the federal government is going to bankrupt itself, basically destroy our currency, the value of our currency, and then everything we work for individually and as states is going to be wiped out. So we need to get busy, and Kansas is really important to us. It requires a supermajority here, which I don't know why they did that, but
that's of both our state house and state senate.
But you have a supermajority of Republicans here, and if you call yourself a Republican, you have to believe in federalism, you have to believe that that 10th Amendment really meant what it said, that the federal government should be limited and the rest is left to the states and the people. And the only way to make that happen is for states to come together and hold the federal government accountable.
Let me ask you, have most of the other states, these 12 states that have adopted the resolution calling for the convention, have they done so by simple majorities?
Yes.
So Kansas was kind of an outlier in that regard, requiring a 2/3 majority in both houses of the Kansas Senate and the Kansas State House.
Right. We're still not that far from it. A vote 2 years ago in the House was only 7 votes short. And I think, and again, this should not be a Republican or Democrat issue, because states, if they look at, if California wants to be a socialistic state, that's their right. Let them do that as long as the rest of us don't have to pay for it.
Well, let me ask, because you said each of these resolutions has to be roughly the same.
Yeah.
Exactly what's in the resolutions in terms of specifics, because there's a popular book out, Mark Levin's, calling for an Article 5 convention. He outlines about a dozen different proposed reforms.
Well, most of those are in 3 different categories, and all of them limit the federal government. There are 3 categories, 3 subject matter areas that we're calling for amendments. The first are amendments to restrain the federal government fiscally, such as balancing the budget or limiting taxation, and importantly, things like the federal government has to use general accounting principles. Otherwise, they're going to get around any kind of balanced budget. The second area of subject matter is to limit the authority and jurisdiction of the federal government. That's primarily over the states. Things like the 10th Amendment, but unfunded mandates, to give the states flexibility to run their schools, to give the states flexibility to work with other states on developing a healthcare system, keeping more of their road money, or controlling federal lands, and that's important to a lot of states. So it's, again, limiting the jurisdiction and authority of the federal government over the states. The third subject matter area is to limit the terms of federal officials, and that includes bureaucrats, judges, congressmen, and senators. None of those ideas by themselves are the solution, but collectively, they'll help solve many of the problems that we have right now.
It's interesting how legislatures are very willing to put term limits on others. For example, the President of the United States, our governor here in Kansas, has a 2-term limit. Legislature doesn't have that. So everybody else term limit, but not us there. Senator, let's take another moment off for a commercial break, and when we come back, we'll continue with the Convention of the States. Well, welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, co-host Carl Peterjohn. Our special guests, Senator Jim DeMint and David Schneider of the Convention of the States movement. So sometimes these amendments seem pretty simple. Balanced budget amendment, that seems to make a lot of sense, but a budget could be balanced by raising taxes, right?
Exactly. And it can be balanced in a lot of different ways. Like a lot of the budget in Washington now is now off budget. Mm-hmm. They'll do different kinds of spending, emergency supplemental. They don't even count that, even though it basically counts towards the debt. So we have to recognize that if all we do is pass a requirement that the federal government balances its budget, that they're going to work around that. They'll raise taxes, or they'll just borrow money, because technically if you borrow money for this year, your budget is balanced, and a lot of states have done that. They're required to balance the budget. So we believe that first of all, you'll never balance the budget at the federal level if you don't get the federal government out of some things. If they keep trying to run all areas of our lives, our school, our health care, our charity programs, welfare, Medicaid, I mean, there's no way they can balance it. Right now, that all of that money has come out of our defense. We've decimated our military over the last 8 years. So the things the federal government's supposed to do, like control our borders, it's not doing very well. And the things that it shouldn't be doing, it's not doing very well either. So these 3 subject matter areas are very complementary. Get the federal government out of some things, force them to balance the budget, but also have tax limitation amendments in there as a percent of the GDP or however they write it, and probably should have some spending limitations relative to the GDP. Otherwise, I know from being there, they can figure out how to get around just about everything. And almost every state is required by their constitution to balance the budget, but almost every state is heavily in debt with unfunded liabilities that they've promised for pension plans and Medicaid and other things out in the future. So we've got to make sure we rein in the federal government and put them in some kind of framework that they can't cheat on.
I think when David was here, he ran this summer. He ran through kind of what the mechanism of all this would be, and I'll put a link to that so people can watch again.
Great.
But some of the criticisms that we see are that there could be a runaway convention. And I think you've alluded to this agenda, but even conservatives are concerned that if you get a bunch of people together, they could start passing amendments to do all sorts of things that conservatives, lovers of liberty, would not be happy with.
That can't happen. I mean, before I thought a lot about it and really looked at how Article 5 was structured and a lot of the historical precedent, that was kind of in the back of my mind that we shouldn't have a constitutional convention. Article 5 is really not about a constitutional convention. It's about a convention to propose amendments. And those amendments have to be specified in advance. And it doesn't make sense to think that 34 state legislatures will call for a convention around specific subject matter. They're the ones who send the delegates. Most of the delegates will be the state legislators who called the convention.
A perk.
It does not make any sense to think they will go and do something different, and then the states that sent them will ratify it. Because there's so many checks and balances. I mean, they all go and they elect a chairman. We've already done a simulated convention. They'll break up into 3 committees to debate amendments in each of those areas. If anything is brought up outside the parameters, the chairman will just gavel it dead. If they were to come out with something that was outside of that, the courts would probably strike it down. And the chances of 38 states ratifying it, if it was different than it's just not possible. But the real risk is on the other side. If we don't do anything, we'll continue to lose Second Amendment rights. If Hillary had been elected, we would have probably lost them completely, along with First Amendment rights, and certainly we'll never get back the 10th Amendment the way it is. And so leaving things in the hands of Congress and judges is the highest risk proposition now. And that's what, when people say, this is risky, I first tell them we're on an unsustainable course. We all agree the federal government will never fix itself or stop spending. What constitutional route do we have to change things? The founders envisioned this, and they gave us Article 5.
But Senator, don't we have a continuing constitutional convention at the moment, and it's called the United States Supreme Court?
And Congress. Any day, Congress can propose an amendment. That scares me more than the states.
Well, but basically we've found all sorts of emanations from the penumbra, if I can quote from a Supreme Court decision, and they come up with decisions right now, and that's why the left isn't pushing for an Article 5 convention in the liberal states that they dominate on the coast.
It's a great question because there's so much case law, so much precedent that with contradictory views. So the courts now and judges individually can make just about any decision they want based on whatever precedent that they prefer. And I think for me, a large part of this convention is basically to throw out a lot of case law with a clarifying amendment that restores that, because now you can't really say the courts aren't following the Constitution. They're following what they believe is the case law related to the Constitution, which gives them no limitations. We've got to restore that. I believe that the courts and the Congress and the President will follow a clear amendment about the 10th Amendment or about the Commerce Clause that was basically there just to allow the federal government to make sure that states didn't charge each other tariffs, to make sure commerce worked. But it had nothing to do with states running, taking over property rights, running schools, because now the Commerce Clause can apply to just about anything.
Yeah. Let's take our last commercial break for today, and when we come back, I'm going to ask a follow-up question about that Commerce Clause. So we'll be back in just a moment. Well, welcome back to this last segment of Wichita Liberty TV for today. I'm Bob Weeks, co-host Carl Peter John, our special guest, Senator Jim DeMint and David Schneider of the Convention of States. One quick question for you, Senator, then I'd like to have David talk about some specific things going on in Kansas. But the Commerce Clause we've talked about a couple times, which is a clause in the Constitution that the courts and the legislatures have used to really expand the power of government. Is it really possible that an amendment could kind of cancel all of these years of precedent court decisions?
Yes, as a matter of fact, it was discussed at the simulated convention that we had last year, and there is good language to basically redefine the Commerce Clause as dealing specifically with trade between the states. That was the issue, that the founders just didn't want South Carolina charging something that came from North Carolina a tariff. And so, but it really was not intended to give the federal government the power to regulate things within states, and that's where the clarification is. If there's something going on within the states, if it's not going across state lines, then states need to have the authority to control that. And if states do the wrong thing, that's bad for the people who live there, but it doesn't affect the other 49 states. And eventually the people living in that state, they'll look across the border and say, why don't we do it the way they do? The problem is when we do it wrong in Washington, we do it wrong in all 50 states. And that's what we have to limit, and that's what our founders intended us to limit.
Yeah. Well, David, being involved in a number of states, including Kansas, your home state here, we're getting ready for a new legislative session and a new governor and a campaign for maybe yet another new governor next year. How does the Convention of the States play and interact with all these activities?
Well, we are gearing up for the next legislation season. We're going to be starting our resolution in the Senate this year. Senate President Susan Wagle is actually going to be championing this effort in the state Senate. So we're looking to go through the Senate this year with that supermajority that we're going to need, and hopefully gain some momentum so we can also get to the House of Representatives this session as well.
Who's going to be pushing or leading this effort in the House and Topeka?
Believe it or not, the Speaker is going to step up, and he's going to be our champion in the House. So they're making this a caucus type issue. They want the entire caucus to come together and essentially back this initiative. So we're looking for good things in Kansas this year. I don't know how we could have better sponsors, but that's the initiative this year.
Could you clarify in terms of the role of the governor in this whole matter? Because I don't think that he has an official role. It's not like a bill.
That's correct. The Constitution specifically states that this is an action from the state legislatures. So the governor really doesn't have a role at all in this whole process, but it can help to have maybe some support from the governor's office. And quite a few of the candidates that are currently running for that office this next year are in support and actually talking about it when they're asked, and our grassroots are out there asking those questions right now. So it certainly would probably be an issue coming up in this campaign.
And you work in a number of states besides Kansas. You mentioned that there have been some successes and maybe not yet successes. How about some of our neighboring states?
Yeah, we just passed in Missouri just this year, as well as we passed the year before in Oklahoma. We're really close in the state of Nebraska. We're up against a filibuster there. We've got one or two individuals kind of holding us up, but we're ready to go in January, trying to break that filibuster. Texas just signed on this year as well as North Dakota. So those are all states that I've been involved in. Would love nothing more than to get my home state on board this year.
And when a state passes the resolution, is that a permanent authorization, or does that have to be renewed once in a while, David?
Unless the state puts a limitation on it, it's permanent until the 34th state threshold is met. Oklahoma's case and Missouri's case, they both put limits on there. Oklahoma put a 7-year sunset, and Missouri put a 5-year sunset on theirs.
Is there anybody who kind of keeps a scorecard on this officially and says, okay, you know?
He does, yeah.
Well, I mean.
Yes, the Congressional Budget Office, or the Congressional, what do they call it, CRC, Research Council, or actually keeps an official count in Congress. Yes.
Well, the question I've heard so often in terms of discussions about a runaway convention, if you go back to our original history, the Articles of Confederation were supposed to be amended, and we ended up with a whole new constitution. And it was interesting because there was a lot of controversy after it was adopted, and without a Bill of Rights that was added by the first Congress, we would have had a very different form of government than we have today if the Bill of Rights hadn't been added. How do you answer the folks who are saying, hey, this can be a slippery slope? Because that is the perpetual comment that I hear when this discussion comes up.
Well, I've done a lot of research on this, and actually it's a myth that the states did not want a new constitution. I mean, it's 10 or 12 clearly in the letters that I've seen expected their delegates to write a constitution for a more perfect union. But do keep in mind, this was an interstate convention, the Constitutional Convention, but it was not an Article 5 convention. Because there was no way to amend the article. There was no specific way. So they got together, as they often did in interstate conventions, without completely establishing the subject matter in advance. It's one of the reasons for Article 5, an amendment proposing convention, and that's why we have to agree on the subject matter in advance. So it's a different framework than the original convention. But if the states had not liked what the Constitutional Convention had come up with, all of them wouldn't have ratified it. So to say that this was runaway, or everybody didn't like what, I mean, they all ratified it, and there are some folks in this country who think it was divinely inspired. So we could use that kind of runaway again, I guess. But again, it's a completely different framework, and for those who say that was a runaway and we came up with something we didn't want, I don't think is historically accurate. But Article 5 lays out the way we do this. The historical precedent tells us exactly how these conventions run. So the idea that we don't know what we do once we get there is completely false. So people are making up a lot of reasons not to do the only course of action that we now have to save our country.
Well, it's a very interesting topic, and we'll be watching how that unfolds. So we are out of time. So Senator Jim DeMint, thank you very much, and welcome to Kansas,
Carl,
by the way.
Thank you.
David Schneider,
Thanks,
Carl Peter John.
Thanks, Carl.
That's it for this week on Wichita Liberty TV. Thank you.
Sign the petition and get your friends and family to do the same. With your full address, your state legislators will know that you really are their constituents in their district. Our success depends on you. So we're inviting you to be part of history. Let's invoke the constitutional solution that's as big as the problem.